Okay, thank you all for joining this afternoon's ASMEBITESIZE session. I'm Eliot Rees. I'm a lecturer in medical education at Keele University, and I'm chair of TASME, the trainee group within ASME. I'm delighted to be joined by Kelly and Jill for this session, and I'll introduce you to them and the talk in a second, but I'll just go through a few housekeeping notes first, if that's okay. So the session is scheduled to last for approximately 45 minutes, and Kelly and Jill's presentation will go for most of that time, but there will be some time for questions at the end, and they'll pause about halfway through to answer some questions on the first part of the talk. If you do have a question to ask, please pop it in the chat field, and we're not going to use the Q&A feature, so just in the chat, and please make sure that you put it to the panelists and attendees so the other participants can see your question, and then they'll know what we're answering. If we don't get time to answer all the questions today, we'll provide a document after the webinar with any questions that we weren't able to address and some written answers. The chat fields are available for you to contribute to the conversation throughout the presentation, so please do feel free to pop any comments or questions in there. But again, please do put it to the panelists and all attendees. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded, and a video of the webinar will be made available on the ASME website, along with any supporting materials after the presentation. If you have any technical problems during the talk, please make ASME aware by emailing events@asme.org.uk, and I'll pop that in the chat field in a second, but email them rather than adding it into the comments, and then someone from the team will be in touch to try and help you out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers this afternoon. Kelly Dore, who's co-founder of Altus Assessments and an adjunct professor of McMaster University, and Jill Darby, a research scientist at Altus Assessments. And they're going to be talking about putting together the pieces of the puzzle, defensibility in admissions and in-program assessment. So over to you both.
Thank you so much, Eliot. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you're well and safe wherever you're joining us from. And thank you for taking the time. I know how busy things are, especially this time of year, and with everything going on in the world. So Jill and I really appreciate your time today. To give you a sense of what we're going to go through, we're going to spend a little time digging into how to identify the constructs or what it is that you want to measure. And then we'll talk about as well how to put that together in an assessment blueprint. As we work through, we're going to give you some examples that either we've lived through or seen as we've done a variety of different assessments, talking about some pearls and common pitfalls. We're going to try and make it practical for you to take some of these tips home. And at the end, we're going to pull all the pieces together and tie it into programmatic assessment. So with that, we're going to start off with a bit of a poll and help us get to know you. So I'm going to launch a poll here, and we're just asking to get a sense of the familiarity with your assessments in general, and what your role currently is with assessments and how you sort of participate and are involved. So if you can just do the poll within Zoom there and complete it. Once I get a few responses, I'll end the poll and I'll share it with everybody. The majority of you have been involved in the creation of some assessments. Somebody is lucky enough to write them in their sleep, which is amazing. Everybody's involved at sort of different levels, whether that's from admissions or in clinical evaluations as a lecturer or researcher. So I want to thank you so much for doing that so that we can ensure as we're talking through this, we're making it as relevant as possible for you. So I'm going to pass it over to Jill to talk just a little bit of orientation as we start.
Hello, everyone. So excited to be speaking to you all. So just before we start, to level set, as not everybody has been involved in creating assessments, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what an assessment is. So the first and most important thing to recognize about an assessment, particularly within a selection or training process, is that it helps you to understand your applicants and trainees and how they can contribute in various ways. Importantly, also, it's part of a larger picture. Assessments cannot do everything. We'll be talking about that a lot and about how to narrow them to really speak about what they can do. So it's part of making a case for competence, you can think of it as. So you're building evidence by having multiple assessments in play. Each assessment does one, maybe two things. To have an assessment involves testing, measuring, collecting, and combining information. It's a very multifaceted process. So there's a lot of different components that go into it. And it's ongoing and iterative, which is another key feature because you never have a perfect assessment first time. You never have a perfect assessment, but you have to be sure that you're looking at it and evaluating the kind of data that you've received and deciding how you can improve it for the future. So when we talk about iterative, it's really every time we administer an assessment, we go back, we look at what we've learned, and we change it for the better.
Perfect. And just as we've sort of level set around assessments, we want to sort of share some themes around what we're going to be talking about. So we are going to be working through some case examples, as I mentioned, and we're going to be talking a little bit about admissions, just because that's the sandbox that Jill and I happen to play in most days. But most of the principles that we're talking about, even when we're working through a case example of admissions, are applicable through the entire life cycle of a trainee, from their admissions and probably even before to medical training, all the way through to when they become a practicing doctor. And throughout this entire component, as we talk about some of the basic principles, we are going to keep a lens on equity. And we're going to talk about opportunities to bring equity into your blueprint as you go through. So that's another common theme that we're going to be talking about. And whether we're thinking about the outcomes for graduates or the good medical practice competency frameworks, there's a variety of different constructs that we tend to measure. Oftentimes, they're put into sort of two big buckets if we want to think about academic and non-academic. As Jill and I go through, we are, again, going to be focusing a little bit more on the non-academic components, just as we work through some examples, sharing our experiences with you. But part of the reason we've chosen to do that is those are sometimes a little bit of the harder constructs to measure. We struggle a little bit more understanding how to measure those. So that's why we're using those as our examples, but it's meant to apply broadly across all of the constructs. And we're going to begin by talking about blueprinting within a single assessment, but understanding, again, these principles that we're talking about also are applicable for blueprinting across multiple assessments in that program of assessments. And we will tie it back together at the end of this. If you're thinking we're only talking about single individual assessments, we're also talking about how to think, even if you're not the one creating or choosing assessments, how to think about putting them all together to make sure that they're reflective of what you want to actually be assessing within a larger program scope.
And with that note, the reason that a larger program scope is so important is that there is no perfect predictor of the future. We know that for sure. That's the only thing we do know. So we have to be remembering throughout all of this that there's going to be error in everything that we measure. And that's okay to accept, but it's all the more important then to consider defensibility when creating assessments. So what we hope to do today is give you some of those tools to create defensible assessments while still understanding that there can't be any silver bullet or perfect assessment that captures everything.
So let's start off with our most political slide. So if you're not an LFC fan, I do apologize. That's where my background is. So I want to start with an analogy that we can all relate to before we dig into a specific assessment example of how do you scout a player? How do you know when someone is good? And I'm using the example of Mo Salah here from LFC. And I think about, what you want to do to know whether or not this player is good is to see them in as many different contexts by as many different scouts as possible. And you're thinking about them in a variety of different contexts as well. So you're thinking about how they engage in different aspects of play, in the practice setting as a team player, and even within the community. And keeping in mind that the more aspects you see, the broader you can understand. But Mo is a great example of you're never going to be able to measure everything. In fact, there's great data, which is, I think, just a really interesting aside, that when Mo joined the LFC, there was actually a decrease within the city of Islamophobia. So there's certain things you're never going to be able to measure, but it's important to keep track and think about, what it is that you are measuring constructively. And so this concept of sending multiple scouts to multiple different games or practice settings to see how this player would actually fit within your team and within your community is actually applicable to what we want to think if we're using an example of UME selection. So this is an example we're going to work through and think about how this would apply, this concept of seeing multiple scouts in multiple games, to what we do in UME selection. And again, this is applicable if you're thinking about assessing competency in program as well. So what we know is that when we see our applicants for the first time, it's a little bit like a black box, or in this case, a blue box, is that we want to know as much as possible about these applicants. And in order to do that, the answer is to sample as much as possible. So sampling across context, types of assessments, different constructs. So those academic versus non-academic constructs we measure across different items with different raters. The more you do that, the more you can get information, this sort of multiple biopsies that you get of applicants, the stronger your ability to actually measure their performance on the different competencies that you think are important. And why that becomes important is that the more samples and the more assessments you do, the clearer and clearer the picture becomes of who these applicants are. I think of each assessment or each question within an assessment adding pixels to the picture of who your applicants are. So the clearer a picture that you get. And we're going to talk about how that can be valuable. When we're thinking about assessments, just to further explain this context, if you're not working particularly right now in the field of assessments, you have a pretty big job. You have to think about how do we establish at the time of selection how these people are going to perform in the future? How do we choose the right assessments to use and measure the right things so that we can predict how they're going to do in training, at licensure, and further into practice? And as I mentioned before, I'm broadly grouping these things into two buckets. So if we think about the academic attributes that we might want to measure for somebody, right now in UME selection, we're using tools that look something like the UCAT or BMAT or GAMSAT, depending on the school that you're from, A-levels or GCSEs, again, depending on your school. And those are the things that we're counting on to help us predict for future performance. So we want to make sure we're sampling broadly across those academic attributes. But we also have non-academic attributes we're trying to sample across. And so in times of interview, we're thinking about whether that's a traditional panel interview or an MMI. Some schools incorporate work experience at this stage. There's a variety of different tools that we use, but our first step is to think from all of our applicants who we can actually bring in for interview. And in that case, we're using things like personal statements, reference letters. We're going to talk a little bit about a situational judgment test, specifically about how that, as a case example of how we might blueprint that, and also holistic review. So all of these components, we need to think about what information they're giving us across the different constructs that we're interested in. Quick definitions in case you're not involved in admissions. An MMI or a multiple mini interview is likened to an admissions OSCE. So originally when they were completed at the school level, they varied at the school, so it was more aligned to the school's mission. But of course, it could be coordinated nationally at a higher level based on constructs that are important. Holistic review is individual consideration of experiences or attributes about that applicant to balance out some of those academic metrics and maybe experiences, and again, also aligned to mission. Now, as a component of what we're going to talk about today, Jill and I are going to be talking about the blueprinting of a specific assessment called CASPER, which is a situational judgment test that we work on at Altus. And the reason we wanted to use this as a worked example is simply because we've spent a lot of time thinking about how we blueprint this. CASPER is an online, primarily video-based situational judgment test. So again, measuring those non-academic attributes. But it is adapted for both geography and level. So thinking about school leavers and how that differs from our expectations of people entering specialty training. So all of those different aspects of blueprinting are things we work with on a day-to-day basis, and why we want to work through this example. So as we talk about Casper, importantly, across the 12 sections, it evaluates 10 different constructs that are sort of give you one general score on somebody's personal professional qualities. And we'll walk through what that looks like as an example.
Okay, so assessment matters. It matters to a variety of people, but it matters because, particularly with high stakes assessment, real decisions are being made. So when creating these assessments, there's a 4-part responsibility. The first responsibility is to the applicants or trainees or students. You want to ensure that the assessment is accurately, as much as possible, reflecting the capacities that these test takers have. So you must be responsible to them in creating that assessment. There's a responsibility to the program. You want to create an assessment that accurately reflects your program's values, mission statements, and classes as well. And there's a responsibility to society, because particularly within professional programs such as medical education, you will be serving the public. So the society expectations are going to play into the assessment itself. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's a responsibility to be equitable. And what this means is considering the viewpoints of people who have been othered, who have been unprivileged, disenfranchised, and ensuring that when you create these assessments, you are removing as much bias as possible. There will always be bias. It's impossible to remove it entirely, but you want to include as many processes as possible to get as equitable an assessment as possible. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and about ways that you can ensure that going forward. So where do we start? 3 things to consider. The first is identify, the second is define, and the third is consider. And that consider piece is the equity piece. So we'll get to that at the end, but it should really be infusing everything that you do as you start to define your constructs. So identify, what do you need to measure? One big question to consider: what is important in your incoming applicants or the students that you have? What is important about these people? What is important to you about these people? So 4 questions. What can you see currently with your existing selection measures? So if you're creating a new assessment for selection or for in-program assessment, we're going to talk about selection specifically, but what can you see currently with your existing selection measures? Do you have things that capture, let's say, the academic competencies, but you don't necessarily have something that captures communication as a construct, which I will be talking about as my example, as much as you would like? So you then have to consider what might provide incremental value in your selection process. So how can you add something else to help you get to a point where, like Kelly was saying, you have a more pixelated picture. I don't know if I use pixelated correctly, but a more clear picture of this applicant that you're selecting for. The other thing that's really important to consider is what you do in training. So what skills are the applicants or your trainees going to need to demonstrate in order to really succeed? And then once you've had a chance to consider all of these, where are the gaps? What are you missing in your selection process? And how can you create something that fills those gaps? So you're going to ultimately identify any missing or underrepresented constructs. It may be that in, for example, letters of reference, you're able to capture some of communication, but it doesn't capture all of the aspects of communication in sort of a broader context. So you want to be sure that you're looking at communication in various forms, particularly given that applicants will have to speak, let's say, which is why a lot of people include an interview or an MMI. And then the big question: what do these constructs mean to you as a program, etc.? And that's where we get into the defining of constructs. So why does defining your constructs matter? That's an important question to consider, because a lot of the time we think we understand what we mean when we say something like communication, but that actually has a variety of definitions to pretty much every individual and pretty much every context. So it's essential to know what you want to measure before you try to decide how to best measure it. So my background is education. So my research has been in pedagogy. So I always play in the sandbox of teaching. And a lot of you are lecturers we saw, so you know exactly what I'm about to say. When you're teaching, when you're giving a lecture, there's an objective that you're trying to get your students or these lecture listeners to know about. So that objective is very similar to having a construct or blueprint before assessment. You create your lesson based on your objective. You create your assessment based on your constructs and your blueprint. The actual creation of the text, let's say, the content of the assessment, needs to be informed and directed by this guiding principle. And then the other thing that's really important to consider is that evaluators must know the definitions. So if, let's say, you're in a multiple mini interview where you have multiple people, like community members, interviewing your various applicants, the evaluator should know what your specific definition of communication is, because otherwise they're going to be bringing their own prejudices, their own biases to the table and evaluating their applicants based on their personal subjectivity. It's not that subjectivity is necessarily bad, and we could talk about that in the question and answer period, because I think we had to cut those slides, unfortunately. However, it is really important that there's a clarity and a level setting for everyone going into the evaluation stage. So, defining your constructs. Let's talk about how to do that. There's sort of 3 steps to consider. The first is reviewing common definitions. So again, we'll stick with communication as a construct. So the first thing to do is a general literature review. Typically, particularly with non-academic constructs, there's not one specific definition that has been given and accepted as true. But there are people who have defined it in different ways. So even a brief literature review, taking a look at different psychometric articles, let's say, that talk about communication as a construct, can help you form a base definition that you can work from. Then you want to go to your competency frameworks, such as outcomes for graduates, because that will give you a lot of context within the specific profession or competencies that are needed there. So it's not just one or the other, it's looking at how everyone defines it so that it's, a fair and clear definition there, but it's also looking at how it is within your specific area. Then you need to identify specific and relevant behaviors and traits, because if we're just speaking about communication, communication is communicating effectively. That's great. There are a lot of competency frameworks, including, I think, CADMEDS, which is the equivalent of outcomes for graduates, which basically says that. As someone who has a background in English, you do not define the definition with the define, you know what I mean? You don't use the word to define it. So how do we define this in a way that's clear? You find behaviors, specific behaviors, to make these constructs a little bit more tangible. So for example, within the competency framework outcomes for graduates, communication has specific behaviors listed under it, such as you must be considerate to those close to the patient and be sensitive and responsive in giving them information and support. If that's a specific behavior that you're looking for, you can create an assessment that actually assesses for that behavior because you know exactly what you're looking for. So that's really important too. The other thing, if you want to step away from the theory and more into the practical and your own experiences, is to think about trainees who have succeeded in your program or struggled, and identify those stories and look at the specific qualities or behaviors that they demonstrated. And finally, it is very important to consider equity and cultural context in your blueprint, in your training, in your content, and your evaluating at every step of the stage. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So when you are defining your constructs, you include your competency framework as well as your school's mission, which is also key. You want to ensure that you're bringing all of the pieces of what your school actually does to the table when defining, as well as community voices. And this is where we start to talk about not only the patient population, but the population of people who are othered or who do not have the same privileges that most people at the table have. And so here we get to equity. So in terms of equity, it's very important to consider a few questions. These are just 4, there are many, but they're ones that I think are important to consider going forward with any blueprint or any constructs that you define. And this comes from, as Kelly has been saying, we have a lot of hard-won experience around this, about trying to incorporate perspectives into our blueprints for CASPER. Because initially, our Canadian version, for example, was blueprinted to the CanMEDS roles. And those CanMEDS roles directly conflict with Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous means of giving healthcare. And so we have been collaborating with Indigenous folks in our community, as well as Indigenous folks in admissions in Canada, to learn more about what that healthcare actually is and starting to incorporate those perspectives into our blueprint. It's a huge process. It's a necessary process. We absolutely have to do it, because if we don't, then we're creating a test that is not equitable. And so it's an ongoing process as we learn more and we keep going back and reflecting. So these are some of the questions that we have been reflecting on that I hope will be helpful for any of you. So the first is to consider who has a seat at the table when defining the constructs, or the blueprint for that matter. But when we saw that we had created a blueprint that didn't have these other voices in play, it was very important to go back to the drawing board and really restructure how we were thinking about things in a different sense, with people who are able to be at the table, who are Indigenous, who are Black, who are BIPOC people, queer people, etc. The other thing to consider is what population your graduates will be serving. So you want to ensure that you have representatives of the communities, such as rural communities, that are present at the table, so those people are able to give perspective that you might not otherwise have. This is an important one because there's a lot of assumptions we make on a day-to-day basis. What assumptions are we making that come from a place of privilege? So most of us have some level of privilege. What assumptions are we making about how things should be based on that place? And that requires a lot of self-reflection and learning, as well as reflection on your program in general. And then also, how can we account for implicit bias? Implicit bias is not going to go away, but there are ways that you can train your evaluators, as well as yourself, to recognize it and adjust for it and account for it. It is, again, a very reflective process. A lot of this has to do with self-learning. It's a lifelong journey that we have to do to unlearn our privilege and unlearn our ways of thinking. And I am happy to provide, I forgot to include a citation for implicit bias training, but I'm happy to provide that after if anyone is curious. So I think at this time, we'll pause. And if anyone has any questions, on the constructs or anything we've spoken about so far, we're happy to answer. And if not, that's fine too. We can wait until the end.
So we're going to give you a few minutes to populate that in the chat, and maybe while we wait to see if there's any questions that come up, I'll just sort of present sort of the tying through piece, because Jill has spent a lot of time talking about constructs and what it is that we want to measure and considerations, and to take through the example of measuring admissions, or thinking about what we want to measure in our medical schools. We do have that common framework that we have in terms of measuring the competencies that we want for a physician. But because Jill has talked about the layering, the analogy that I use is that, well, we all might be trying to bake a cake, and this will resonate for Nick, because I think he and I talked about something similar at an INRESH workshop on baking bread, that we all want to bake a cake, but there's different ingredients that we're going to use, and we're going to maybe use those ingredients in different proportions. And as we think about what those proportions are, so we're going to end up baking a cake, which is all sort of, towards the same end goal, but they're going to end up looking different. And that's the influence of our own specific community, our own curriculum, our own mission within our medical schools that end up doing that. I'm just seeing that, thanks, Nick. I'm just seeing that Helen's got a question here about how we can start benchmarking assessments with qualitative aspects. I think that's potentially, Helen, can you tell me what you mean a little bit in terms of do you mean that they're constructed responses, or that they're verbal responses rather than multiple choice? Is that what you're asking? I'll just give her a second to make sure, just to make sure I'm going to answer the right question. But what we want to say here is that we're all working towards baking a cake. You can have your list of ingredients, but the goal with identifying your constructs appropriately and actually blueprinting them is that it's okay to be different, but you need to be an informed different. And I clarified with Eliot at the beginning that this is, not my Pinterest fail, but this is just a Pinterest fail I found on the internet. I do have my own versions of failed baking, but I thought I wouldn't share them with you. And I should say, if it's easier, you are welcome to unmute yourself to ask your questions if that's easier for you. So Helen's just clarified when asking observers to form subjective judgments and providing qualitative feedback exactly when observing practice. Perfect. So Helen, when we're asking observers to make subjective judgments, I think there's a few things that are important. I'll let Jill jump into this as well, and we'll talk about them. The first is making sure that you've level set, that they have a clear understanding, and also this is for qualitative feedback, of the things that they should be observing and the expectations of that level of performance. So if you have them looking at a first year versus a final year medical trainee engaged in a similar activity, your expectations are going to be different from them, and making sure that those are clearly delineated and outlined for the faculty supervisor or reviewer. So making sure that they understand the level of expectation of performance, but also the content that they should be evaluating. We all have biases as evaluators. There's certain aspects of performance that we all tend to gravitate to, whether that's communication or empathy or maybe medical knowledge. And so making sure that people are informed as to what actually needs to get evaluated on different rotations or in specific, after a specific lecture is critically important. And that's part of the blueprinting process. You're never going to get it right because obviously people's performance will vary significantly. And oftentimes that's where the Likert scale on the assessment, if you're thinking about a clinical evaluation, is insufficient. Grading them on a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 7 scale doesn't give you all the information you need. And that's really where you need to provide those qualitative comments, which are the richness of the information. And actually, Schiffer Ginsburg out of the University of Toronto has done some great work on that as well. Jill, did you have anything?
Sure, I can just add to that two things. The first is how important it is to define your constructs precisely for this reason. If you are going to have evaluators who are evaluating on communication, if you have clear behaviors for what you're looking for, it's a lot easier to get consistent judgments and benchmarked ratings is what we call them. So benchmark ratings, if everybody knows exactly what they should be looking for within the definition of communication. And then the other thing that can be helpful, again, this comes from my pedagogical background, is rubrics. So making sure that you have clear and well-defined definitions of what like an excellent applicant does at this stage versus a mediocre applicant versus a poor applicant. So having that clarity is one of the most important things that you can have to create a less subjective assessment.
Nick has asked another question, so thanks, Jill, around, he likes the idea of sample, 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 and how do you know when it's enough? That is an amazing question, because I think that's one of the hardest questions to answer. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we frame our blueprint to help us identify what it is that we're actually measuring and is that sufficient. But part of that feeds into the iterative nature of the assessment. So do you collect enough information to predict problems or excellence in performance, and that you may need to iterate the assessments that you use or choose based on the data that you're getting about your applicants? Because if you're not able to sort of identify people who are maybe bumping along the bottom in terms of their level of performance, they're never dipping below, they're not failing, but they're bumping along the bottom, then maybe you need to adjust your assessments in a way or identify your flagging in such a way that you do pick up on those people, or maybe you need to add a different assessment that focuses on something else. So Nick, we'll try and address that as we go through the blueprinting talk, but I welcome you to add back in questions if you want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because I think that is the key question here. We only have so many resources, so how do we make sure that we're using them effectively? So just to transition to the next, but again, please keep populating the chat so that we can answer your questions. Institutions tests may perform very differently. So your applicant pool, your training pool influences the assessment that you use. So you could, and you need to understand how these tools build on each other. So to Nick's point, when do you know when enough sampling is enough? And that's thinking about what is each tool or assessment adding to your understanding of these applicants or trainees. And to think about be different, but be an informed different, I want to give you an example that's a little bit different. It's an in-program example. So I've had the opportunity to work with a variety of different programs and specialty programs as they've been doing their assessments, working with them. And I was asked to observe an OSCE for an orthopedic specialty training program. And when I saw it, I was really excited. They were trying to make it new and different and add different question types and things like that. And it is very resource intensive for them to put together an OSCE for their specialty trainees and get them all together and devote the faculty time and the trainee time. And what ended up happening is that as they requested from broadly across their faculty, everybody to create questions and to send them in, and everybody was creating their own question. In some cases, they were creating their own marking or scoring rubric on it, which is problematic in itself. But what ended up happening is that they didn't get enough questions, that faculty became busy and they were sending in questions. So it fell actually upon one specific faculty member to create a lot of the OSCE questions. And what ended up happening is that this very resource intensive OSCE that they'd blocked off residents and faculty time for ended up focusing quite a bit on orthopedic cancer situations, because that was the specialty of that particular faculty member who was developing the question. And because there was no blueprint to tell them exactly how they should be framing these different questions and how many different questions they needed of different kinds and on different topics, they ended up falling back to their own familiar area. And so a lot of the assessment ended up being on orthopedic oncology, which skewed actually what was being measured and in fact became a wasted resource of time. And that's why Jill and I get so excited and passionate about the concept of blueprinting, because it can be incredibly helpful. So let's jump into this, because we've talked about multiple biopsies or sampling across your trainees, but we want to talk about now how to put those pieces together and connect them. Blueprinting is one of probably the most commonly overlooked pieces in assessments in programs. And while we talk about blueprinting our curriculum, when we don't blueprint our assessments as well, we actually end up undermining our curriculum. So if we're not assessing it, oftentimes they won't pay attention. How many of you have given a lecture and people wanted to know if this was something that was going to be on one of their examinations or their licensing exam, et cetera, and that's sort of where they end up focusing. So if we measure it, they will assign weight to it too. So we need to make sure that we do create a blueprint for our assessments and it's aligned with what we actually want to measure and what we intend to measure. Because otherwise, as the example I just gave, we're wasting our time and resources for all of us. So why do we want to blueprint? Well, I think one of the best examples that it creates a lot of transparency, whether that's for applicants or our current students. They understand what they need to do. For applicants, they know, is this the right program I should be applying to? Are they aligned with my scores or how I'm doing or the things that I'm interested in? For students, they know whether or not they're up to speed. They know the areas that the programs are focusing on. For faculty, we talked about, if they're assessing somebody in a clinical situation, are they looking at the right things? Are they setting the right levels of expectation? If they're giving a lecture, what are they putting their focus on? Is that the right topic? We all know that oftentimes faculty may use we use the term can talk. I'm not sure if that's a common term, but a talk that they've given before. And oftentimes that may not be exactly aligned with what we want the students to know. So the more transparent we can be, the better. It also is helpful for programs and accreditors, whether that's the MSc or others. It has them actually know that what you're intending to teach and the mission mission and the goals of your program, if you're focused on, particularly rural education, how are you measuring that your trainees are going to be set up for success when they go into practice in that area? It also creates buy-in. So we have linkages with our priorities and what we're assessing, so we know we're putting our resources in the right way. It also, to Nick's point on when are we doing enough sampling, can identify gaps, redundancies, or when we're just completely inconsistent in what we're intending to do. But I think importantly, it also builds a defensible process. So both for the individual assessment as a whole, that we know this is to some degree a defensible assessment. Obviously, there's other psychometrics that go into that, but that's a piece of it. But also when you think about programmatically, do we have a defensible assessment process? And so factors that go into that is that we can eliminate with blueprinting is construct over or under representation. That's when we're measuring too much or too little of a particular construct. So once you've gone through all the work that Jill's described of identifying what those constructs are that you want to measure, well, again, like my OSCE example, if you just ask one faculty member to create the assessments and they have a particular interest or area of specialty, you're going to end up with too much of some constructs and too little of something else. So while orthopedic knowledge or discipline knowledge is important, what we've actually seen when we break down what that discipline knowledge is that was expected is that we had too much orthopedic oncology and too little of foot and ankle or spine, if I'm getting those correct. But it also can help us make sure that we're actually thinking within and across assessment, what is important to our program? And then in the case of selection, at what stage of selection you use something. So we're going to talk through an example of if you have a measurement that you use in selection, so perhaps their GAMSAT score or something, if you have that and you're using it to identify who you want to interview, and then you're also incorporating that score later on to evaluate who you're going to give an offer to, that's absolutely fine, but you just need to be aware that you're double weighting that particular assessment and therefore potentially overrepresenting those constructs, again, unless that's what you want, and that can be done intentionally. And then you can also have something called construct irrelevant variance, which means you're measuring something outside of what it is that you actually want to measure, and it impacts your ability to actually use the score to understand competency, etc. So I've given an analogy here of a simulation setting where a team is actually going to intubate a patient and you want to measure team communication during a difficult intubation. Well, you could be measuring it in this team setting, but I think one of the things that we would think about as construct irrelevant variance is the actual simulator that you're using. Potentially it has sort of a rubber tube that requires a certain amount of lubrication in order to properly do the intubation. If the person being assessed doesn't know that, they're going to struggle, and it's going to cause behaviors that are completely outside of what you would want to measure and are not representative of how somebody would actually perform in their actual true behaviors, because they're going to be struggling with the intubation and perhaps getting frustrated with the simulator rather than actually being able to focus on maybe the team communication that you wanted to measure that would be reflective of a real life scenario. So questions that you might want to ask yourself include Jill's work on what are the important constructs, what are the key aspects of the constructs that you really want to measure. So we talked about constructs being very complex, like we'll talk through communication, for example, is what aspects of that construct are really, really important for you in your program? Where are your trainees struggling? What are the aspects of it that you've measured in other assessments? And so therefore, what is still left to measure? And how much you should be giving to something, how many times you need to sample something, and then thinking about, are you doing it with defensible or reliable measures? And that actually allows you to create this beautiful matrix. And so I'm sharing this as an example. This is obviously a bit of a made-up example of our Casper blueprint. So we have 12 different scenarios. We have 10 different constructs that we want to measure in these scenarios. You could imagine this likened to the different constructs that you want to measure and across a multiple choice examination as well. So the way that we've particularly framed this is that we have primary, identified in the darker blue as A, and secondary constructs in sort of the very light blue, gray as B. And what we try and do is lay out each test to identify what is our primary construct that we're measuring in each scenario. What is the secondary construct that we might want to measure? Because in these sort of things, it's complex. If we're measuring communication, we're not just going to measure communication. We're also might be measuring things like motivation or resiliency in their response, because to Helen's point, when you have these sort of qualitative responses, they tend to get complex. So having, in our case, our raters, or in other cases, faculty members, understand what is the point if you're sending them into an OSCE that you actually want to measure in here. It can be really helpful and directive to know if they're aligned on measuring the same thing across different trainees coming through. And so now we just want to quickly pull all this together in turning these individual assessments into a program of assessments. And why this is so important is that we've talked about all these little pieces together, but we need to think about how we pull them together in the bigger picture. So let's talk about the construct of communication. And we work it through this a lot, but we wanted to sort of carry this through. Communication doesn't happen in isolation, as we've just sort of talked about. There's verbal, there's written communication, there's nonverbal communication, there's empathy that overlaps with it and breaking it down. So the more we take these larger constructs and we break them down into their subcomponents, the more accurate or aligned our assessments ends up being to the things that we actually want to measure. And that can be quite overwhelming. But when we think about communication, it actually overlaps with things like collaboration and empathy. It's not just happening in isolation, as we've talked about before. And so I've used the example of an interview as well as Casper, which are both focused on measuring non-academic attributes. But what I'm trying to show with sort of this Venn diagram is that they're identifying different pieces, that they're focusing on different aspects, and that even when you're using both of them, you're actually measuring different pieces of communication. And what that means is that the more times you're measuring communication, the clearer picture you get of somebody's competency in that larger construct. So again, highlighting the value of needing to have these multiple assessments across a construct as well. And so this was the example I gave earlier of thinking about how you're strategically, in our admissions example, combining assessments so that they might be measured intentionally multiple times. And then you take that matrix that you had before where you do it across a single assessment. And I've just simplified a version here. I'm happy to share a much larger version of this. I just couldn't fit it on the slide in a way that was readable, where you actually think about what are the constructs that are measured by different components across the different constructs that you want to measure. And in this case, I gave the example where a construct, and that might be communication, you actually break it down into subcomponents. And you think about how that might be labeled or identified through different assessments. And you can sort of get through that matrix understanding of whether or not you're measuring the different components enough or appropriately across.
So David had a question in the chat, which I might be able to address a little bit here, but I'm sure Kelly will have other things to say. So some take-home thoughts before we open it up to more questions. 3 take-home thoughts. There's no perfect solution. So we've talked a lot about sample across multiple constructs, across one construct to get as clear a picture as possible. Point number 2, map a defensible assessment and process, which is aligned to the school or the program's mission and goals. You want to identify your gaps, define the constructs and blueprint, and that will give you that defensibility when looking at the evaluations. And finally, measure what matters. So ensure that you're not spending too much time measuring construct irrelevant variance, and you must consider bias. So this goes back to the equity conversation that we've been touching on throughout. Construct relevant variance and consistency between instances. So this, David, is where I will speak a little bit to it and Kelly will continue, but build on mine. But I think the key with consistency between instances is to have very clear guidelines, particularly for how you develop questions. So ensuring that you can return to specific aspects of a question that you're including, so that the questions might differ, but they're targeting the same kinds of behaviors. And this comes back also to a blueprint. So the reliability necessitates a blueprint that you return to again and again that highlights the same well-defined constructs, and that gives you a reliability that you would otherwise not be able to have, particularly with qualitative assessments. And in terms of assessors, in terms of assessors, the training is key, and making sure that they understand each construct that you're going to measure. So this, I'm speaking to Casper specifically because that is my experience, my sandbox. So you want to ensure that every assessor or rater has a very clear understanding of all of the constructs that you're measuring, so that they can pick out these different pieces as they look at these complex responses.
And David, maybe one thing I'll add to that is that the importance of piloting your questions and having them reviewed, because some of those things like construct irrelevant variance, especially if you're using different forms or different versions of an assessment across different times. So very simplistically, using an example of an OSCE where you want to run 2 different sessions of an OSCE, or even an MMI where you want to run it on different days, making sure that you have the scenario reviewed not just by other faculty members, but ideally perhaps by your current trainees, maybe who aren't doing the assessment, or others who can make sure that it's going to be interpreted as measuring the same constructs underlying, and making sure that there's no construct irrelevant variance in one, which would make it perform. Of course, there's a variety of different item analyses that you can do in terms of differential item functioning and things like that, which can look both across item performance, but can also be used to determine whether items are performing differently for different subgroups in your population as well. So there's lots of things you can do about that. And I'm going to just pause here and ask if there's time for maybe some questions. Of course, Jill and I are willing to stay on. And of course, happy to dig into any of these other questions as well. So Eliot, maybe, I don't know if you can see anything.
Yeah, so I think that was the only questions so far. So there's a question from Ramya. So how can you explain the difference between an assessment and an evaluation?
Yeah, that's a, Jill, did you want to, or do you, oh, perfect. So that's something I would say that sometimes the term evaluation is used interchangeably with assessment for some people. I think we try and think of them a little bit different. So assessment is actually the tool or the items that you're using to measure a particular construct. And sometimes we think of evaluation as sort of the program of evaluation of the process. I think it differs a little bit between countries as well. So I'm not sure if that's the proper UK definition. Eliot, if you want to chime in there, I'm just talking about how we have defined them as separate, like thinking about a program of evaluation to as a bit of a QA process, but an assessment is actually the tool itself.
Yeah, I think broadly similar in the UK context. I think we would usually consider evaluation in terms of the quality of educational programs, and assessment being of individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there can be assessment of teams and things like that as well. So thinking, yeah, I think that's great. Lovely. Thank you, Ramya.
Are there any more questions for Kelly and Jill?
And of course, if you want to dig into any of these topics, feel free to message us. I was saying to Eliot earlier, when Jill and I get together to talk about blueprinting, even as general concepts, we get quite excited. So if you are one of those people who want to dig into this a little bit more, we are more than happy to have a virtual coffee and chat about these things in a lot of detail, because we tried to make this a bit of a high-level overview, but happy to dig into any of these concepts.
Well, I think unless there's any immediate questions, just want to say thank you very much, Kelly and Jill, for a really fascinating talk. It looks like from the comments that people have really taken a lot away from it, and certainly I found it interesting to see. So the only other thing I wanted to say was just thank you to everyone that's come along and participated in the session. Just to remind you that the video will be available on the ASME website in a few days, and to keep an eye out for any future bite-sized sessions. So the next one is on Wednesday, 16th of December at 16:30 GMT, and that's a coffee break session for anyone that's missed those coffee break chats that you have at conferences this year. So have a look on the ASME website and sign up for that if that's something you're interested in. And yes, thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, Jill, for a really great talk.
Thank you all for coming and your time, and thank you, Elliot, for moderating so well.